I have a long history with creationists. In fact, you might say that anti-creationism was my first passion when I dropped my ridiculous religious beliefs and started fighting against religious irrationality. I still keep an eye out for creationist stupidity, and that's what happened when I stumbled across Creationist Stephen Myer trying to explain why his position isn't, in fact, fallacious, that it actually makes more sense. Yeah, not so much. So, let's go take a look. Well, rejecting theistic evolution is just good sense, since we have no reason whatsoever to think that any gods of any kind actually exist in the real world. But let's see what he means by God of the gaps, shall we?
A God of the gaps argument is an argument that has a formal logical structure that in logic is known as an argument from ignorance.
Well, it's a little different than that. The God of the gaps argument really consists of moving God into the gaps in our knowledge as science moves forward and disproves current assertions about God. Essentially, it's saying science has disproven my claim about God here, but what about way over there where science hasn't gotten to yet? Therefore, God did it. So in reality, that's just an argument for ignorance, asserting that because something has not been proven false, it must therefore be true. But a lot of people really don't understand how these things work.
It's an informal fallacy.
It is indeed an informal fallacy, which is a fallacy that depends not on the form of the logical syllogism, but on other failures. In this case, the God of the gaps argument fails because its premises are faulty and demonstrably untrue. Now keep in mind that the God of the gaps was, in fact, created by theists, most notably Henry Drummond, a 19th century evangelist, and Ernest Barnes, the Bishop of Birmingham in 1933. And it's not only a religious fallacy, it happens with a lot of pseudoscientific woo. Alien conspiracy theorists often use the same kind of argument, demanding that aliens exist to fill any gaps in our scientific understanding.
Arguments from ignorance have the following form. If I say cause A is not sufficient to produce effect X, and then I say, therefore, cause B must have produced X, but I have no independent evidence that cause B can produce X, then I've committed a fallacy of arguing from ignorance.
Actually, you've performed a false dichotomy fallacy, and that's where you assert that there are only two options, and if one option is disproven, the other option must be true. Cause B only becomes reasonable to accept when it can be shown that cause B actually does cause X. Otherwise, maybe cause C or cause D or any other cause might be responsible. Now, it's worth noting that this is also ridiculously widespread, not only in religious apologetics, but in other things like the aforementioned alien claims.
Because just because A isn't sufficient to produce the effect in question doesn't mean that some other cause did it. You have to have independent evidence that that other cause is capable of doing it.
And it's funny that as much as he acknowledges this, that the religious are perhaps one of the most guilty parties of committing these blatant fallacies. I mean, I wouldn't say if the religious knew how to make logical arguments and didn't engage in exactly those same arguments, but they do. They just do. So how do you get around all of the irrationality if you know, at least in the broad strokes, that these arguments are fallacious? I just don't get it.
And that then becomes a God of the gaps argument when you say, well, various natural processes aren't sufficient to produce, say, the origin of the first life or the origin of the first animals in the history of life. And then if I were to say, therefore God did it, that would be a God of the gaps argument. It would be an argument from ignorance.
Unfortunately, that's pretty much all the religious have when it comes to arguments. And let's be honest, they don't care. They just don't. They aren't interested in whether the arguments hold up to logic or reason. And I think Stephen Myer here knows that they don't care. And when it comes right down to it, I don't think he cares either, because neither he nor any other religious apologist has any non-fallacious arguments to offer.
But that's not how we're arguing when we make the case for intelligent design, because we're adding an additional premise. We're saying that various kinds of natural processes are not sufficient to produce the origin of new functional information.
How in the world do you know that? Where did you get that information? How did you test it? Because, as we're going to see, he's going to dive right back into the God of the Gaps argument, commit a logical fallacy he's already admitted he knows about, and won't see a thing wrong with it.
And we're specifically dialed into the presence of the digital code that's stored in the DNA molecule that performs important biological functions. It's information in a very specific technical sense.
It's information that, at the moment, we really don't understand how it works, even if we're learning more every single day. So how can you say that no natural process can create this information if you don't even comprehend how the information operates?
So we say, we show that various natural processes are insufficient to produce these large infusions of information we see arising in the history of life that are necessary to build new forms of life.
Even if what you say is true, how do you know there aren't other natural processes that we simply do not understand yet that are not responsible? Again, he's coming up with a false dichotomy here, where he asserts that because option A can't be responsible, option B is responsible, without ever showing that option B can perform the functions he claims it can. Hell, he can't even prove option B is real.
But then we point out from observation of the world around us that we do know of a cause that does produce information. We have independent evidence that intelligent agency, that mind, that creative intelligence can generate information.
But you're not talking about a mind, you're talking about an invisible, intangible, undetectable deity for which you can offer absolutely no objectively verifiable evidence did it. We as humans are not aware of any mind that is not physical. You are pulling these claims straight out of your ass because it makes you feel good.
You and I are doing it right now as we're talking. We're trading notes, trading information. So information is, in our experience, a mind product. We have independent experience that minds produce information.
But not that gods exist, or have minds, or are capable of anything. We only have the experience with physical minds. So any claims of experience with non-physical minds is inherently fallacious. The only argument that might come from this line of reasoning is that there are super powerful, possibly extra-dimensional physical aliens that did it all. There's still no evidence that any of that exists, but it's certainly more logical than what Myers is throwing out there.
And so when we infer an intelligent agent as having acted in the past based on the presence of digital code stored in the macromolecules of life, we're not arguing from ignorance, we're arguing from our knowledge of cause and effect.
Wrong. You're arguing entirely from ignorance because we have no evidence that the non-corporeal, non-physical, all-good, all-powerful being that you suggest actually exists in reality. That's like saying the only explanation is magic. Well, obviously, that's not true. But you're engaged in fallacious thinking, in fallacies you've already shown you understand and reject intellectually, but you're only too happy to bring them back up because you really have nothing else to talk about.
And specifically, what we know minds can do,
namely, come from physical brains, because that's all we have any knowledge of in the real world.
Namely, produce information that merely undirected material processes can't.
And again, How do you know that? We don't pretend to know everything about undirected material processes, do we? Let's be honest. The overwhelming majority of scientists have no problem at all accepting that these undirected material processes are responsible for the origin of and the evolution of life on this planet. So where are your scientific credentials? Well, you got none. He got his PhD in history and philosophy. I really don't know why anyone would take this jackass seriously on any scientific subject. I mean, seriously, this guy got a degree in philosophy from Cambridge, and he doesn't seem to understand logical fallacies, and he certainly doesn't recognize them when they come out of his own mouth. I really don't think Cambridge has that pathetic of a philosophy program. So either he didn't understand the subject material, or he's being dishonest, which I find to be a whole lot more likely, especially given the kind of people you tend to run into in creationist circles. This is especially true when you realize that Myers Discovery Institute also runs the Center for Science and Culture, which utilizes the absurdly irrational wedge strategy to try to get creationism into public schools. These people are Looney Tunes, and Myer really isn't any better. So you've got blatant dishonesty running amok, someone with the educational know-how to understand where he's wrong, yet he still pushes the same old tired creationist bullcrap because, as is no surprise at all, he cares more about his feelings than he does about the facts. I wouldn't put lying past him for a second. In fact, I'm pretty sure that dishonesty is on page 1 of the creationist playbook. He's just playing make-believe with reality, and then he expects anyone to take him at all seriously. Sorry, pal. Not on a bet. Not on a bet.